Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new ForoCompetencia breakfast. We have the honor today of having James Keyte, who is the director of the Competition Law Institute at Fordham University. And he will be speaking today about a very intriguing topic that I will not spoil it. I will let James present it. James, the floor
Hey,
is
thank you
yours.
very much. And hello to everybody from wherever you happen to be. I'm in here in New York City. First, I guess a quick disclaimer. I'm the director of the Fordham Competition Law Institute, but I'm also currently a partner now at Boyce Schiller in New York City, having been a partner for a long time at Skadden Arps. And so I have to let everybody know I'm speaking today just in my capacity, more my academic capacity with the Fordham Competition Law Institute. First, I want to thank Julian and the organizers so much. It's a very successful organization you've been running for a very long time, and also for his incredible support for Fordham over the many years. So it's a great pleasure to be with you this morning. The topic that I'm addressing is a very important one and continues to be a very hot one in the U.S. and outside the U.S., which is whether the antitrust enforcement in the U.S. has become politicized, and to what degree and with what effect, and is it new? Um, this is what I'm going to be talking about today. And everywhere I go, people have views. I spoke a month or two ago in London at the Economist Conference, and this topic was one of the main subjects. And then again at Andreas Mundt's um, uh, conference, global conference in Germany, and it was also uh, front and center. Um, it's interesting in the U.S. I never really thought this would become, uh, a major topic. I remember going to an NYU conference a few decades ago, or a decade and a half ago, and there was a speaker, I forget her name, from a South American country, who was very concerned about the politicization of antitrust enforcement because um, they had kind of officially moved beyond the consumer welfare standard and were taking into account a variety of other values. And her concern was that antitrust enforcement would change based on the whims of whoever had the power. And she had seen that happening in her country in South America. And I thought, well, okay, that the problem is elsewhere, but not in the US at the time, because I'm a bit of an old war horse when it comes to antitrust and been doing it since the 80s. Um, at the time, we were still in the US, in the consumer welfare standard is the guiding principle. Certainly, we had some of the post-Chicago school, uh, forces and in the case law developing, but it was all fairly settled about what guided enforcement, what guided the various merger guidelines, collaboration guidelines, and whatnot. And it was still, and as you all know, in the U.S., ultimately you have to go to court to get remedies if you're the government, including private parties. And the consumer welfare standard was prevalent, and by the way, still is prevalent there. And so what we're talking about today is not so much going to court and getting remedies. It's what are the enforcers doing, and are they being guided by traditional antitrust principles and economics, or to what degree has politics insinuated itself into enforcement decisions, analysis, and consideration. Um, to understand the role of politics in U.S. antitrust enforcement today, you actually need a little recent history because I don't think the subject to be understood properly starts with kind of Trump administration one or two. I think to understand it, you really have to start with Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor. Not so much directly, but what they brought in terms of expanding um, consideration into other values. And so I'm sure most everybody kind of knows this, but I'm going to go through it. The neo-Brandeisian view of antitrust was a very direct rejection of a predominance of the consumer welfare standard and a technocratic like effects analysis. They overtly and are more dedicated to the concept of structuralism, um, almost going back into the US to the 68 kind of guidelines, where both monopolies and oligopoly structures, um, are bad and tend to accrue profits to the suppliers and are not good for citizens, is not good for small business, and not good for workers. And they brought other values, to the table in terms of antitrust enforcement, including distributional effects, labor, fairness, equity, and these other principles. They also brought in that administration the notion of the whole of the government, that antitrust has to fit in to other parts of the government and enforcement and working together. And this was, frankly, I think, came out of Tim Wu working with President Biden and the executive order that made that clear. And so, at least my view, haven't talked to a lot of people about this, is that Lena Khan and Jonathan and Tim Wu kind of opened the door to other values, to to move away from the predominance of the consumer welfare standard, and brought in these considerations. Um, some would be viewed as populist in their own way, and certainly a much greater focus on the average citizen, on workers, on labor markets, and on distributional effects. Um, and they brought this really to their enforcement decisions. I will say they didn't, in the US, since it's not like an administrative system in other jurisdictions, in particular the EU, they were a little more shy when it came to what they would actually sue on in court. And so they were still going after what I will say are traditional deals with market power at issue, whether it's um, mergers, or big tech, and um, and we saw that in what they did with the case law. So because I think it's when you understand what Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor did, I think it's then easier to understand what happened with Trump too. Uh, and this concept that I think it's important to understand that Mark Mader, early on, one of the FTC commissioners, not that there's many of them anymore right now, um, Mark Mader made a very important speech on the concept of populist conservatism, which seems like an oxymoron. But what he explained, well, first, what didn't happen with Trump 2, and certainly also a bit with Trump 1, but Trump 2, there was not a return. Republicans come back in power, and there was not a return to traditional, consumer welfare standard, um, Chicago school type economics predominating. there was there was the embracing of populism, but with a twist of adding conservatism. So um, when you read Mark Mader's initial speech, it is quite interesting because three-quarters of it sounds like Lena Khan. Um, it's all about anti-monopoly, anti-big tech for these entrenched alleged monopoly positions, and it was also about the history of, in a sense, under a consumer welfare standard and just a price-driven analysis of the hollowing out of manufacturing in the United States and being sent abroad and then coming back with low prices in the U.S., but with workers who couldn't necessarily afford them, et cetera. And so, in some sense, Lacan and Jonathan Cantor and the neo-Brandeisians kind of opened up this idea of looking at other values and in almost a Hegelian, kind of dialectic. It was then a springboard for Trump too to adopt this notion of America first and this populist idea that no, he's going to focus, his administration is going to focus on American workers. They're going to focus on, national security. They're going to focus on being essentially taking the lead in innovative industries, AI, big tech, other things. And then, of course, there was the continued obsession of China, 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 um, in relation to this America First idea. And so I see America First as not actually purely politics, but somewhat of an extension of what was happening in with the neo-Brandeisians and the rejection of the consumer welfare standard as the prevalent um, intellectual force, behind antitrust enforcement. Now, the other thing you got at the same time in Trump too, um, with uh, at the time, I'll get to this, Gail Slater, and Andrew Ferguson, was also this notion of it's populist conservatism. So what that brought back, which is a little bit more traditional conservatism, was kind of a hands-off approach to consolidation, except as it related to creating monopoly positions, not burdening, kind of the whole deal world with, large and complex investigations were not needed. And something that becomes important going forward, a much greater willingness to reach settlements, including conduct-related decrees, um, in the deal process, and as we will see later, even in Section 2 monopoly dominance cases. Um, and so, and it was certainly anti-regulation, hands off, none of this, kind of support for ex ante regulation that you see in Europe and that you now see in the UK. So all the stuff that Klobuchar and others were planning was certainly completely off the table. A side note that there had been some um, momentum from that, in a sense, with kind of the conservatives and the right not liking what big tech was doing with free speech in their view, and then obviously the general view of the Democrats in terms of big is bad. And so there was some momentum before that, for some potential um, legislative approach in the U.S. But that certainly is gone with kind of the populist conservatism on the conservatism side. It was fairly predictable. It's something I had Fred Jenny, um, Eleanor Fox, and I wrote about, actually, even when Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor took over. So that's kind of the framework leading into this question of kind of the role of politics is there was, in my view, and we've done this at the Fordham conference and some other conferences, there there is at least some degree of cohesion when you look at this notion of populist conservatism. Um, you have to set aside, when you think about that, the chaos centered around Trump at all times. Um, and you have to kind of, okay, it's it reminds me a little bit of a total welfare kind of approach in Canada, the citizen standard in Australia, where you are looking also not just at the demand side and lower prices and consumer welfare standard with the Chicago kind of underpinnings, but also, looking more at small business, at labor, overall markets in terms of production innovation. And um, so there is certainly some cohesion to it, um, just not as simplistic as a standard consumer welfare standard. So that is kind of it's kind of at the beginning. Then we get what clearly was a change in process coming out of the White House, a change in norms. I mean, in the US, there is a tradition of the FTC being an independent agency and even of the DOJ acting somewhat independently, even though it's more captured in the executive branch. Now, the pure conservative view is this kind of unitary executive power that, well, the president, in a sense, is the boss of the DOJ and has all the appointment power for the FTC, and then what he says goes. But that was not the norm. That's not how it was set up. And certainly, if you look at the history of the FTC, which Justice Brandeis helped start in 1914, it was kind of viewed as being set up as independent. But there was a change in process where the White House or the DOJ was more involved in earlier in the process. I will say it was not a complete change in my practice back at Skadden. I certainly worked on deals where we worked, the Congress, and we worked kind of the White House a bit to try to get behind some deals. But we always kind of viewed that was kind of a soft push and might have some indirect effect, but nothing too direct. But I saw some effects of that in some of the deals I worked on, one including American Airlines, U.S. Airways, which was a merger coming out of bankruptcy of American Airlines. Um, the difference that was happening was happening in the Trump administration. One, this kind of involvement was actually more transparent, happening earlier, and most importantly, started to involve lobbyists with more significant roles in the process. There's always been lobbyists. They've always had a role, but it was more behind the scenes, more without a seat at the table, so to speak. Um, and certainly in Trump 2 White House, that has changed. Everybody has probably read about this gentleman, Mike Davis, who I don't know, but has been involved in a lot of the deals and some other things. And there's other lobbying firms, again, that have been around, but have taken more active and earlier roles. And so everybody's quite interested in, well, what happened, with Gail Slater? I don't have any inside information, but from the outside, I would say that it appears that she comes from a more, kind of traditional process where the DOJ is doing its own analysis, is listening to the parties, to economists, but does not really, was not really interested in talking to lobbyists or other people that, may be coming out of the DOJ or affiliated with Trump or the White House. Um, and at least my gut feeling and what I've read indirectly is that, she was not letting others into the sandbox to play. And so she was kind of put out. It seems that Andrew Ferguson hasn't had those issues, and maybe, he's more receptive to what is going on. Um, Again, I think the white if you talk to people, and I have, who were in like Trump one or in the administration, they're saying they just think that this is um, that it may be a change in norms, but they think it's not inappropriate, that it is part of in a sense, again, this is what I talked about before, the opening up of other values, and the other values are, can be anything from industrial policy to trade to national security. And so this is kind of, in my view, whether there's a direct correlation with the neo-Brandeisians kind of moving away from the guiding principle of the consumer welfare standard and opening it up, but certainly in Trump too, they kind of flipped. Okay, it's not going to be about equity, fairness, distributional effects. It's going to be about U.S. manufacturing, U.S. dominance. It's going to be about national security, and at times it appears potentially about who has the ear of the president in terms of what he wants, and that's where it gets dangerous, I think, in terms of the independence or the rule of law. And that's where it gets a little sticky with respect to uh, the use or the greater role that we seem to see with respect to lobbyists and whatnot. And so, you've all probably read about the deals. HP Juniper is a good example where that became front and center and led to two important people in the antitrust division leaving over it. Later, more recently, we have Live Nation settlement that again, people were worried was really the result more of lobbying than a traditional analysis and compromise in a litigation setting. I I think there's a little bit of truth to both. Sure, there was that, but I think it is not uncommon in the US to make settlements of mergers, undertakings, as we say outside the US, in mergers and also in Section 2 cases. I think the Live Nation, it was kind of the gut feeling was there was such a good Section 2 case, they should really just go all the way through with it like they have with big tech in DOJ search and ad tech. Um, and so that heightened the concerns, that these were very quick fixes in the middle, essentially, of trial with Live Nation, uh, when things were going quite well. So it does raise some concerns. Now, one thing you need to understand probably with respect to the U.S. is there are some guardrails, particularly with respect to the DOJ. There's a thing called the Tunney Act, where any settlements by the DOJ, if they're consent decrees, have to go through a Tunney Act process, which is a judge essentially having to bless them. Now, some would argue they're kind of rubber
Pero el
stamped.
tema es que no tiene ningún párrafo 37.
Sorry, Catalina. There's a notion that they are kind of rubber stamped by the Tunney Act, and there is a lot of discretion there, but there is at least one kind of guardrail there. And the other thing that's happened with the U.S. is, the state AGs kind of found themselves in this environment. They have always, since the 1990 American Stores merger decision in the Supreme Court, the state AGs representing the citizens of their states have standing under the antitrust laws to seek damages and injunctive relief. And so I think with this trend, the state AGs have gathered themselves and started to exercise their power. And so they continued the case in Live Nation. I think they won a jury verdict on the liability, and now they're dealing with remedies. So that doesn't necessarily solve issues of politics and lobbying going on at the federal level, but from a consumer perspective, it is something that is pushing back. So in the U.S., then I do think then that there is a new normal, that it does involve values that are not extremely troubling as it relates to international competitiveness, national security, manufacturing, innovation in the U.S. Those have at least a feel of kind of complementary values involving, industrial policy and things like that. The concern is that, and it always is kind of Trump related, is that, well, it's more than that. It's favoritism, it's personal relationships with respect to Trump, and what role do those play, if at all, and how do you deal with that? So there is, I think, a heightened risk right now that the rule of law feels compromised at times in the U.S. We hear, the traditional kind of U.S. people talking about that, Bill Kovacic, Herb Hovenkamp, Eleanor Fox, and we see also at the OECD, at least prior, Fred Jenny in the past has talked about that, and it's talked about it globally. And so we need to make sure we have people that operate with integrity, with respect for the process, that it's transparent, and that there's at least perceived fairness. The interesting thing about the Trump administration, very often it is transparent. It's just troubling. And so we're on that kind of edge of really pushing the envelope of what is, a guiding principles of antitrust with other values. My personal view is that I've always, and maybe this is just because I'm old, is that, and it's more like with Herb Hovenkamp, I still think consumer welfare should be kind of the centerpiece, and concerns about market power should be the centerpiece of and guiding principle of antitrust analysis that can transcend, different shifts in political power and administrations, and that traditionally has also been the case outside the USA, outside the US. Let me just say a few things about things outside the US, because it's not just the US where, you have certainly these other values coming into play, including some form of lobbying going on. There's a long tradition in the EU, of looking at other values and helping companies. We think about Airbus and the subsidies and, kind of propping up that industry. But, that traditionally they were less overt. They were, I would say, less politicized, more industrial policy. And then, of course, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Draghi report in the EU and trying to foster growth, trying to create some degree of either national or EU champions to fight the global competition with the US. I've written in the past, I don't know if it's true, that risk capital, tends to be drawn to the US because if you dominate and you win, you can price how you want, and you generally don't have to share your intellectual property. Whereas now, in the EU, they want national champions, they want risk capital, but now they have the DMA and they have aggressive views about leveraging and tying, and they want a level playing field when that doesn't really necessarily incentivize risk capital and innovation if you are penalized once you win. And I still think that's a very big picture thing that favors innovation in the U.S. We also see EVP Ribera also prioritizing growth and investment. And so these these also have a tendency to certainly compromise traditional um, antitrust enforcement analysis and values. Although I would say it, the consumer welfare standard, there's always been a more prophylactic view of antitrust, uh, in the EU than in the US to begin with. I just think they have a dilemma, trying to deal with the idea of leading innovation and having national champions or EU champions, while at the same time being very, very strong on antitrust enforcement and penalizing, essentially, in my view, penalizing firms that succeed if they have competitive advantage, even inherent in their success. The UK is really where it's quite interesting right now. If we all remember that Andrea Cocelli at the CMA was very, very aggressive with big tech and with deals, and in some sense found the UK often being an outlier in stopping a deal that was approved everywhere else. This, I think, upset the tech world, and there probably was a lot of direct and indirect kind of discussions and lobbying about that. But what we also had in the UK, similar to the EU, is a recommitment politically to trying to grow their economy in tech, in AI, and in other industries, and to work with antitrust enforcement with a very transparent set of processes and kind of rules to bring in these other considerations into the antitrust analysis. And Sarah Cardell has been very open about that, and also open that that involves some degree of politics, some degree of lobbying. And so it is interesting, and it may be a bit about personalities, what's going on in the US and centered around kind of the reaction to Trump is in large part also going on in the UK. But it's just more polite. It's less offensive in many ways. And I think we also see, again, this move away from the consumer welfare standard into these other values, in Australia with its citizen kind of welfare approach. We see it in Japan. I actually am assuming we see some of these other values also in South America and other places where, industrial policy and global competitiveness have just become an issue for a lot of countries. And as well as, kind of the flip side of that coin is having industries that are healthy and vibrant for their workers. So for now, I'll just end by saying that the antitrust enforcement hasn't been completely hijacked by politics and the in lobbying activities, but it's certainly a very significant issue and risk that hopefully all the discussion around it and concern around it would have effect on the administration. But there is not a lot to do about it in a tangible way, because it's about what they're going to enforce, not whether they're taking the cases to court, in which case the judiciary is involved. And so, Julian, that's kind of the overview, and I'm happy to address any comments or questions from all of you.
Thanks, James. I have a question. In a way, you said that the Lina Khan administration was a turning point with regard to the consumer welfare standard analysis in at least at the federal level. How have it's been now some years now? How has this change been taken by the courts? Have they been open to accept this change, or they have been still?
Yeah, no, it has not been. Not in any significant way in the courts. The courts are still primarily centered in their analysis around the consumer welfare standard, but the consumer welfare standard over the years in the courts has flexed. It's opened up a bit so that innovation and future competition is certainly broader. So the consumer welfare standard isn't in the courts is not like purely short-term price and cost. It does capture innovation and effects there. It reminds me, a number of years ago with Vestager speaking at the Fordham conference where they said, "Do you need to, change the consumer welfare standard?" And she said, "No, no, it's broad enough to capture what she was concerned about, which was longer term effects and dynamic competition and innovation." And so those are still there. You are not going to be able to go to a U.S. court and say, "I'm worried about a distributional effect," even though there's not market power or there's not, any harm to competition or price effects or output or innovation. And so those are just in the US because to force somebody to do something, you have to go to court. Those were values that were, more academic and more speeches than action. Even, Lena Khan had talked about getting rid of all non-compete provisions across the US. Those are covered by state law, and they're very complex depending on whether they involve transactions or senior executive. There's a lot in the state law, and there was really no power in the FTC to go and do that. There were some powers the FTC had that were frankly unexercised over the decades that I thought Lena Conch can and did was trying to take advantage of. But changing substantive analysis of the states for something that had that long tradition was just not in the power of the FTC. So a lot of what the neo-Brandeisians talked about were unachievable, and they knew that. I mean, if you look at the House report on big tech in 2020 or 19 or 20 that Lena Khan, when she worked at the House, probably drafted, they said most of the things we want to do require overruling Trinco, on the leveraging, changing the consumer welfare standard and whatnot in the courts. And so this is not like in the EU, where if DG Comp has a new theory, it could go play with it, impose remedies and whatnot, and which is also, frankly, what can happen now with the new DCCA or whatever it is in the UK, their new act that gives the CMA much more power to do ex ante regulation, certainly in the big tech space and probably other spaces. We just don't have that in the US. It's only the courts. There's no kind of serious regulatory antitrust environment. And so, yeah, none of that captured the attention of courts, and they didn't even really try. They knew to do something, extreme. They kept that, to the speeches and some of the guidelines. I think that some of the guidelines got a little bit too extreme as well. But Andrew Ferguson decided not to just keep changing those back and forth. But I wouldn't view the merger guidelines currently as significantly operational on their face.
Thanks. Esteban, you had a question?
Yeah, but thank you, James. My question was the same as Julian did, but maybe if you said that, but how do you see the future? Is there any chance of some influential changes over the judicial review over the courts, or this academic debate will beat with the wall of judicial review and go back and maybe in a sense or in a direction of convergence to consumer.
Yeah, I think it is primarily an academic debate, but the practical issue is, well, let me start with no. Yes, I think the case law will not change, won't change rapidly, that's for sure. It may expand. I'm sure that the courts will be receptive, for example, to looking at markets and effects on the upstream on the buy side, and also we'll look at labor markets more than they have in the past, but using traditional principles about output and consumer harm, and maybe harm to innovation. And so there may be more focus on some of these areas that do overlap with the neo-Brandeisian type values. But otherwise, no, it's academic, but it's also in what the administration, whoever is in charge of that administration, wants to go after, or where they're going to make settlements and compromise. Because most companies don't want to fight it out in court, even if they think they have a good chance of winning. It's in the context of rapidly happening deals, or it's easy, for some of the big companies to make a deal. And frankly, for big tech, for example, a lot of the changes they have to make, they're coming because of other jurisdictions causing them to make these changes, whether it's in the UK now or in the EU. And sometimes they'll just make those changes throughout their system, but not from the US courts. We'll see, by the way. We'll see in ad tech, and we'll see in Google search, and we'll see in some of the Apple cases. But keep in mind, all those cases involve, for the most part, traditional things like coercive tying and bundling, exclusive dealing, sabotaging rivals. All of it still reads very much like Microsoft 2001. It's just there's so much money involved in protecting your monopoly position, your alleged monopoly position, that it appears that these big tech firms were willing to push the envelope on some of these behaviors, and they, when a jury or a judge sees them, they just look completely unjustifiable, actually. So,
Pablo.
Thank you, Julian. Hello, everyone.
Hello,
Professor. A question on institutional setting, if you have any reactions, namely on this, let's say, this model of independent regulatory agencies that started in the US in the 90s and expanded all over the world. We see in recent times this, in a way, being challenged. Not only in the FTC, but also in the central bank. I'm referring to the US. How do you see this? How do you see this evolving? I mean, do you think we are questioning this model? Do you think? How do you see the future of this model in the recent and maybe further future?
Yeah, it is being challenged, and this is one where it will go, where they do go to court. Because one thing about Trump is that he presses the envelopes of his executive power. And we've seen that in many, many areas. And we see it now, with respect to the FTC's independence. We see it with some other agencies and behaviors. And so the tradition of independence of certain agencies, and this gets into this thing, if you've read about it, the Chevron doctrine, and essentially, what did Congress actually, how much did Congress empower certain agencies to kind of do their own thing? And then there's obviously constitutional issues about what can the president do with his or her power, her eventually, someday, power with respect to agencies that traditionally have operated independently. Those are being litigated, and they will be litigated. And this is where, the Supreme Court is probably not as conservative as everybody thinks in some issues, but it is pretty conservative on this one. So, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, in particular, have strong views on this kind of administrative state that took over, in their view, over the last several decades. And they are fairly receptive to the executive taking back or exercising its power to control what Congress has not, without violating the Constitution, given to various agencies. And so I think there will be a shakeout. But given the composition of the Supreme Court, it is very much going to shift largely towards even more executive power.
Thank you very much.
Felipe.
Well, thank you.
Felipe, how are you?
How are you? Nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much for your candid description, of the U.S. situation. I have a couple of questions. The first one is regarding the past.
Yeah.
What we did wrong. Looking at the current stage, of what's going on in the U.S. Suppose that we are 10 years ago, thinking about this and supposing that this would be happening. And what do you think that the authorities might be doing different? Regarding the past, and then I have a question on the future. Suppose that you are the founding father, and you would like to change the structure of the U.S. institutions. What are the changes if we understand that this political situation will continue and maybe this disconnection with capitalism and also geopolitical openness that we have been seeing, in the, I don't know, last 30 or 40 years. So what are the changes that we will need to have antitrust institutions somehow in tune with much more political influence on other industrial policy values? And then I have a question on is this also happening with other regulators, not just the antitrust regulators, but I don't know, electricity, banking regulators? Are they facing the same challenges as we are facing? In the antitrust field.
Yeah, let me go through these. The past, what could have been done differently, maybe to anticipate this? Well, of course, one, elections have consequences. So, setting that aside, I think maybe there could have been some benefit to the agencies, both of them being more on the same page and operating and aligning their analysis more with the case law. And this is why I think, when the neo-Brandeisians came in, frankly, with Biden a bit asleep at the switch, and probably, I don't know, this is speculation, but, Tim Wu, kind of part of the neo-Brandeisian world, kind of getting in there, and whoever appointed, a very young Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor, in some sense, they departed radically from, and even though they cite, in the things they write in guidelines, every case they cite is like these 1960 Supreme Court cases that are not technically overruled, but are completely inconsistent with all the circuit court cases, from in recent decades. And so I do think that once once the agencies depart so radically from the case law, they're and into what can be viewed as having political ramifications. They invited the same thing from the next administration. And and just as Trump, in many ways, winning elections was a backlash for perhaps politicians not paying attention to certain constituents. What Trump too did with respect to this kind of populist conservatism notion was also a backlash to what the neo-Brandeisians were doing. They took some of it, but they also, you know, took the populist idea and then turned it into this kind of jingoistic America First notion. If if agencies had kind of stuck with and what they could do in court and then tried to push the envelope in court on with cases that they are willing to lose, push the envelope on expanding beyond the consumer welfare standard. If you look at the raising kind of the post Chicago school raising rivals cost notions of Steve Salop and all those guys, those had an impact in court in analysis. There is no longer assumptions that markets were self-correcting. You looked for information asymmetries. That had an effect. And so, if you wanted to focus more on labor markets and on other types of effects and work them within the case law structures and reasonable extensions of it, that would have been a better process than these politicized, highly contested politicized values that now have become a game of who's in power and what are they pushing. And they just don't have to go to court. They'll just operate in the world, of settlements and not going to court. And so I think that is the departure from question one. Question two, the future. You can't. I think will it settle back in? Depending on now, it's going to be kind of a seesaw of who's in power. I think certainly Trump is unusual, somewhat transactional kind of, president with a view of what do I want to get done? Whether you like him or dislike him or whatever. It's what do I want to get done and who am I making happy? I can't imagine. Now, some would say that Obama in his own way, was similar with use of executive power and and pushing through some healthcare stuff, just with different values. So sometimes it's like, well, who do you agree with? If we're looking at it kind of neutrally, both parties are pushing this. And so then you get to the issue of, can Congress do anything about it and pass some laws? And this then gets into the, the 60 vote issue. Are you going to blow up the filibuster rule or whatever they call it? Are you going to actually get any legislation passed that matters involving antitrust enforcement? And I think that is a hard thing. It's hard to get 60 votes in the Senate. And you also don't see people necessarily in Congress, because they do have the power to turn that into a majority vote. I don't see that really happening. And so I think it'll settle. Now, could they pass some rules about the role of lobbyists and all that? They'll have a lot of those already. And so I think the future needs to, through political and other popular pressure, at least try to return to something where the rule of law is respected, whatever interpretation is going on. That's part of the agencies being more aligned with what the court law is and trying to work with it instead of being, extremely outside of it, and then making sure that what they do in antitrust enforcement is consistent with that. And I think currently, I mean, if you talk to Gail Slater, she would say that's what she was trying to do, and ran into maybe these political forces. And so I think in the future we'll have to hope to return to some of those norms because Congress, I don't think, is going to be able to force it. Other regulations, yes. I mean, but this gets into I think, Diego, the debate on the administrative state and agencies exercising more power than Congress gave them. And the Federalists, or whatever, the Heritage found, this was part of that plan was if Trump took over and Trump too, they were going to look at all these agencies and apply those principles. And those principles are more debatable and, part of case law that the Supreme Court has to address. They're not as kind of extreme and provocative as just kind of lobbyists doing things that seem to have no, substance or principles underneath. These are principled fights that will take place, and then in the Supreme Court will oversee those.
Great. Flavio?
Hello. Thank you so much, James, for a fascinating talk. Maybe this is not something you can answer, but I wonder whether you have a theory of mind of Lina Khan and people like her. Because on the one hand, I think that the neo-Brandeisians and people like them, like, for example, the CMA today in the UK, they want to have growth. The neo-Brandeisians, can refer to the Sherman Act as one, worrying about political power. And I think these are things we should all worry about. But then I think we also agree that maybe competition policy is not the right tool for addressing those questions. And so the question is, do you think that Lina Khan actually genuinely thinks that is there a methodological divergence that she thinks that this is the right policy tool? Or is it more like, she can't actually get anything through the courts, and so this is just an opportunity for people to posture and to raise issues
No.
that they think are important?
I think she truly believes it's a right policy tool. It's grounded in a somewhat nostalgic view of Brandeis himself, who really wanted markets where citizens could start their own businesses, and the kind of like small business and kind of the guild system, and that there would be no dominant firms, there would be no massive oligopoly structures that in Lina's view resulted in just wealth transfers from workers to owners. And so I think I've read most of what she's written, and I've read a lot of the Brandeis stuff. And so Lina, more so than many of the other kind of neo-Brandeisians, really is a student of it and believes in those principles. But for me, it's a little romanticized about how the economies work. And so when I think of that, I think of more of the Schumpeter-Ken Arrow debate on, about innovation, what is better for innovation? Creative destruction with cyclical dominance, kind of a, Schumpeter view, which is more of a U.S. underpinnings of Trinco and these other cases. Or is it Ken Arrow's later view in the 60s that, no, those are lethargic monopolists who are just going to, not innovate anymore and protect their position? We see a little of both, I think, in the monopolists coming out of the U.S. But Ken Arrow would prefer a more, disperse power with small businesses trying to innovate and capture share, without, running into the massive scale advantages of large firms and network effects. And so I think Lina Khan and the neo-Brandeisians line up more with that, but it's somewhat unrealistic with the nature of innovation, at least globally, is much more in the creative destruction world where you capture the market. And this is what led to, just kind of the ex-ante regulation, of the CMA and what's going on in the UK now. It's a bit of a cheat. It's kind of like, okay, we can't really win these enforcement things. Remedies are way, way too slow, certainly outside the US. And so we're just going to regulate it. And when you look at kind of gatekeepers and strategic market status that invokes these regulations, it's not even traditional monopoly power. And so it's a bit of a fantasy, in my view, that it's antitrust. And I get concerned that they're not letting innovation, kind of run its course. At the same time, I've written with respect to AI, that there should be a great concern. AI is one of the more competitive worlds that we've ever seen. I was writing an article, Antitrust Magazine, about AI and antitrust law. And by the time I was reading a UK report, and like 3 months later, there was another UK report, and there were 300 entrants between the two reports for large language models and other aspects. And there was even, competition coming to cloud computing and the chips. But the real issue there, of course, is the capture of all of it by big tech firms that have the capture of the users. And that then falls back to traditional analysis of tying and whatnot. But so the answer to your question is no, she's sincere. It's a bit romanticized. And there's probably something in between what, what she would want to do. Um, the last thing I'll say is Posner wanted to do it too a little bit. At one point, Judge Posner wanted to make oligopoly interdependent pricing and follow the leader and all that Stackelberg and all that kind of stuff. He wanted to say that is price fixing. This conscious parallelism in oligopolistic interdependent markets should be viewed as price fixing. And you see this a little bit, obviously, in algorithmic pricing today. But he lost that debate with others because people would ask, well, what's the remedy? Are you going to tell an oligopolist that you can't base your pricing on what you learn in the market or understand from the market or the logical pricing activities of your rivals? And so we have that difference between US and non-US as well. And so I think market forces often kind of drive what is a reasonable view of antitrust kind of law and enforcement and policy.
Giovanni.
Yes, thank you. So my question is, as we know in the statutes of the Federal Trade Commission, it says very clearly that no more than 3 commissioners can belong to the same party. So in a way, this political dimension is part of the very nature of the institution and has never been a concern because the competence and the professionalism of those who were appointed never created a big concern. And of course, there have been different economic theories but my question is, but do you think that there might be a change rather than in the case law, but more in the policy? In the sense that, for instance, when we look at Dina Calais' statements, she's the
I know Dina, yeah.
Yeah. For instance, the stress about innovation, but considering that, for instance, the Trump administration is very much let's say, not supportive of green technologies. And so do you think that this political standings for certain technologies may have an impact in the way in which DOJ and the FTCs may be operating at the policy level?
They certainly do. They certainly have an impact on what they're doing in terms of policy. You have the whole issue, with kind of green technology and should you loosen up collaborative activities? that are trying to create, products and whatnot that are more green. I think these are legitimate policy debates and discussions that, frankly, in the U.S., um, are appropriately administrative specific. I think you certainly in the U.S., can have these policy differences where you want to emphasize something and de-emphasize other things. Um, the case law on these things, though, don't seem to care about that. And so, if we're all if we're all chicken farmers or pig farmers and we want to you know, either create innovation that we kind of jointly control or prevent innovation that will harm us all and dress it up in green, you know, that's going to be litigated and it's either going to rise and fall on whether it's anti-competitive coordination. So, um, in those, you know, I think the antitrust principles we have can still fit that those types of collaborations. Um, and so in that sense, I think those are other values and political things that I think appropriately can come and go and be different. And even Vestager had to kind of, I remember, when she used to come to Fordham early on, she's like, I don't even, she didn't say it this way, but it was like, sustainability, that's a different topic. And then, 3 years later, it's like, oh, it's really important. Okay, whatever. On the FTC side, I actually don't know specifically. I haven't read whether this tradition is statutory based versus rule based. Um, um, and so this is one of these that will likely be litigated. It is certainly a norm that we all are used to. Um, that there would only be three from one party. And then usually there's just horse trading, there's bargaining on the appointments of like, okay, you give me of that three, maybe you have one or two that are particularly conservative or have a particular view of the then administration, and you give me those, and I'll let you choose, a certain type for your two. That has been the kind of the history. And so this is just going to get wrapped up. I think there's a lot of posturing and blustering, obviously, from our leader in the White House. I think he likes to, kind of bait people, or whatever you call that phrase, in getting people upset. Um, uh, and so I think that the notion that like he would appoint all five from one party. Um, Again, I don't know the legal basis. I don't think there's a legal basis for that, but there may be. I don't. You never know if it comes out of his power, and that these other things were institutional norms as opposed to statutory mandates. I think though that he is. I don't think he's serious when he makes those kind of comments, though. Um, but you never know, right?
Great. Thanks, James. Your concluding remarks.
I think, well, one, thank you all for listening, and hopefully it was informative, not things that you all knew completely. And but I could tell, based on all the really, really good questions that one, these are important issues that you all are really on top of the issues. I guess my complete, in one sense, um, when I look at this topic, I say, well, okay, maybe keep calm and carry on, although, you got to be careful quoting Churchill these days, you can't quote anybody, but there is kind of a keep calm and carry on. At the same time, how do you keep calm if the rule of law is at risk in a legitimate way? I think there is some risk to the rule of law, um, but it is fairly particularized by there's, it's a handful of transactions and litigations that have been, and they get an enormous amount of press. And when you look at them, you say, okay, I mean, that's not necessarily a purely political solution, that if you compare it to other settlements, if you compare it to, and so I think there is a lot of noise and bravado on both sides, including the criticism of it. Um, uh, but I think there should be more transparent discussion of all of that, so that we can kind of calm things down if they need to be. Because when I listen to Bill Kovacic and others, I think the sky is falling, and then I say to myself, well, how do we analyze whether the sky is really falling? Shouldn't we analyze whether we may not like this new norm, but let's understand it. Let's maybe try to be more transparent about it, and then assess, how far outside of the norm is it really, when we look at, for example, settlements of mergers or settlements of litigations or particular postures. Um, and because the gut reaction is, oh, that's not really a national security interest, or, oh, the White House is not allowed to care about whether, the U.S. remains dominant globally in the future in AI. Well, they can. I mean, that's that's part of being the executive in the United States. And so I think there needs to be more analysis and transparency, and hopefully that will expose that the problem isn't as great as it appears. But I'm not necessarily confident that would be the case upon inspection, I guess, is my concluding remark.
Great. Thanks very much, James. This has been great. And thanks for your generosity as well. And to the rest of
you all at the Forum Conference, we'll be putting out the subject matters in the next couple of weeks. But it'll be another interesting times and interesting conference, I'm sure. So great. And well, I invite you next month. The breakfast will take place on a Monday, and on Monday, June the 8th, but it will be for a special reason. It is our 25th anniversary, and we're going to have special guests, 6 of them. I'll send the information to the group shortly. Thanks. Good. And if it's in English, I am happy to listen in myself.
Thanks. No, this time it's in Spanish.
Oh, okay. I'll skip that one.
But we have a very special guest for that's why we're having a special time for our.
Well, I think it's fantastic what you've been doing, and I'm glad to be a part of it this week, this month. So,
thanks, James, and thanks everyone. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, James.